Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the World Health Network YouTube channel. My name is Ben Calderwood, and I want to welcome you to the first episode of a new video series here at WHN, focusing on the stories of people living with long COVID in their own words. A little bit of background, this series is helping launch WHN's Long COVID Awareness Project, and that's an effort to educate people about the long COVID crisis, to explore the numerous health impacts associated with long COVID, and create opportunities for action and for advocacy. And specifically, we want to use this time to reach out to people who are fortunate enough to not have been impacted by long COVID thus far. The long COVID community needs allies, right? It needs people who are willing to reckon with the urgency and the reality of what amounts to an ongoing mass disabling event and make choices accordingly. And we'll talk a little bit about what those actions and choices might look like with our guest later. Probably the most important thing I think to share at the top as we get into these conversations is that everyone is at risk. Long COVID is not limited to people with pre-existing health conditions or perhaps those who have not been vaccinated or any other group. If you've had COVID, you're at risk for post-COVID health impacts, long COVID included, which leads us to the best way to avoid long COVID is to avoid COVID infection entirely. For more information about this, for more information about long COVID and WHN's Long COVID Awareness Project, please visit whn.global. Today, for our first episode, we're speaking with Crystal Burke, herself a WHN member and a COVID long hauler. Crystal is located near Ellsworth in Down East Maine. I think Crystal is a great person to kick off this series with. She's a great person to speak to in general, but her life experiences, as you'll see, allow her to speak on this topic with, I think, a certain kind of special authority. So welcome, Crystal Burke, to the broadcast. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. I guess the biggest thing to kick off with is just that I am a long COVID patient, but I'm also admin for one of the long COVID support groups that I can talk about later. And I am also the head of the disability group at my work and also work with several of the other long COVID support groups. And so I am ingrained in this throughout. And I use what I know about long COVID and my experience with it through each of these support groups with my family, in my role as a school board member, and in everything else I do, because it's part of my life to the point that I can't escape from it in any way, shape, or form.
That's a great introduction. Thank you for that information. Before we get into, I think, details about your long COVID experience today, tell us a little bit about, your background and tell us what your life was like before you got sick and before long COVID.
I, going way back, my background is in veterinary medicine. I was trying to become a veterinarian. And I eventually had to give that up after multiple tries and near misses. But I still managed to get myself a small farm. I've got 3 kids. My oldest has Down syndrome, so complex medical history. But I was also an avid hiker, rock climber, backpacker, fisher. I have goats, chickens, ducks, rabbits. I'm missing a bunch of animals, but I have a small farm that's very diverse. And I still maintain that despite probably it being too much effort for me. I'm also a research scientist. I work in genetics. And we were slowly working on introducing our kids to all of the many and diverse, highly energetic activities that we take part in. We had, right before COVID began, we had an asbestos exposure that was starting to cause health problems. I had a greater than 50% lung function reduction. But even with that, I am incredibly active in so many ways, or at least I was. Now I physically cannot do most of those things, and I have to regulate myself emotionally and mentally as well. Otherwise, COVID robs me of the ability to even get out of bed. So it's not just that I can't go hiking, it's I can't do anything to any excess or I might cause myself further permanent damage.
When we were preparing for this interview, you spoke a little bit about that. You spoke about how even just making the choice to participate in this project and sharing your time with us here today, that was an expenditure that you would likely experience consequences for. We'll talk a little bit more about symptoms and COVID impacts in a moment. Can you share a little bit about that choice?
Yeah, so we did a little bit of prep for this, and we spent a couple of hours actually talking, and that meant that for the rest of the evening, I basically had to just go sit on my couch and go to bed early, and that the next day had to do my bare minimum, because if I pushed at all, I was not sure how much longer I could stay standing. Like it takes energy to do anything, and my body does not recover anymore. My husband makes fun of me for having difficulty doing the dishes now, and I was trying to explain to him that it's literally the cost of, can I stand or can I move my hand repetitively? Like I have to choose between those two activities because I cannot do both for more than like a few minutes at a time. And so this is using up mental energy. Sorry, my computer. This is using up mental energy that I will not be able to spend anywhere else. And that has physical consequences as well. And like all of it potentially leads to a symptom flare up, or it's called post-exertional symptom exacerbation, or malaise, which is like, some people think, oh, you're just a little tired, but it is your body gets so heavy you physically cannot lift it, and you can be completely bedbound or couch-bound, or like unable to even like hold a thought in your brain. It depends upon what type of exertion and how your body responds, but in general, that's PEM, post-exertional malaise, and post-exertional symptom exacerbation.
Are you able to judge when you make decisions like this? Are you able to judge how long that recovery might take?
No, I can take a guess after I've been at this for 4 years.
I see.
So we're approaching 4.5 years. So at this point, I have a little bit of a baseline for what my energy envelope is. And I do use things like smartwatches and other tools to measure my heart rate and exertion. So that way I can see roughly how much energy I'm spending. And there actually are tools out there. I've lost. Sorry, I've got to look it up. I've got an app on my phone.
That's okay.
There's an app called Visible that actually sells a product that you can use to measure how much energy you're putting out through the day. And so that way you can look and see like, how much energy have you exerted in the past, and like at what point does it tend to make you crash. So you will actually get a warning of, hey, you're approaching your crash line. Solve.me, I think, is coming out with one. And then products like Garmin have an energy battery as well. But so there's lots of tools that are starting to come out to help us with this, but batteries wear out, in which case you can't wear them all the time. And like it's really a fine line. And sometimes you'll think you've stayed within your envelope, and then surprise, you crash anyway.
I think that's a term, energy envelope. I think that's a term that probably a lot of people who are not familiar with discussions like this are not familiar with. And just, I follow up on that question because it sheds some light on how much, scrutiny, how much thinking through these circumstances and these symptoms is often required of people who are experiencing this condition. Let's jump now to, we spoke a little bit about your background, about your life before COVID and before the pandemic. Let's talk a little bit about how you got sick, what the circumstances were there, and your experiences seeking care and seeking treatment at that time, and where that takes us to today.
I will jump on that in just a second, but I'm going to introduce you to one more term because I'm
Okay.
likely to use it in my description. In the disability world, especially chronic illness world, for a while, there's been a term called spoons as another way to describe that energy envelope.
Yes.
And the rough analogy is every person in the world is given a certain number of spoons to represent the amount of energy you have for the day. And for those of us with ME/CFS and long COVID and other chronic illnesses, often we're given a smaller number of those spoons, and certain tasks can take a lot more. So like just taking a shower might be an entire spoon. If you've only been given 5 spoons for the day, your shower took 1, your meals take 1, like for each meal, and then you've got 1 spoon left. What are you going to do with that today? And if you use that, you crash and burn. So I initially got COVID in March 2020. As I said, my daughter has Down syndrome. She also has other complex medical issues, including severe obstructive sleep apnea, which also is basically her airway is misshapen. And any exposure to respiratory illness often meant we were in the ER with her, unable to breathe. And we were already warned pre-COVID that we needed to avoid any respiratory illness for her at all. And so we had taken her down to get surgery at the nearest children's hospital is 4 to 6 hours away. Unfortunately, it's Boston. And this was March 2020, very beginning of the pandemic. I called every day for the 2 weeks prior to our appointment to see if they were experiencing an outbreak in Boston yet. And every time I was reassured, no. So we were there Friday, the 13th of March. And we
You remember the
got
specific
COVID from her
date?
surgeon. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's Friday the 13th,
That's a good
2020.
point.
But we likely got COVID from her surgeon. And the Boston announced an outbreak, especially in their medical system, the very next day.
I remember.
By 2 days later, on the 15th, I was already spiking a fever. I'm typically hypothermic, so spiking over 101 is like a major serious fever for me. And
Hypothermic, I just want to say low temperature. Yes.
Yeah, hypothermia, low body temperature.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my normal temperature is around 97 before COVID. 96.8, and every nurse says I've got it backwards, but no. But so over 101 is a major problem for me, and I was spiking up to 103, and felt like it. So I called the doctor, and 3 days later, she agreed to try to COVID test me. And I went to the back of the clinic, and she came out to my car fully gowned up and sent my test off to Georgia to the CDC's lab. And then we never actually heard about that test ever again. I got a call from someone who said they were the lab, but there was lots of red flags in the way they introduced themselves that suggested they were not actually from that lab. And I'd been calling my doctor every week or so to see if they had gotten results back yet. And this was about 4 months later is when I got the phone call saying, "Oh no, your test is negative. Don't worry about it. You don't need to call your doctor's office anymore." And I'm like, okay, well, if it's negative, then that means that all the symptoms I'm still experiencing must be due to the asbestos exposure. And that means that I am rapidly progressing into potential mesothelioma. So you guys need to come deal with this somehow. And they're like, "Oh, wait, you're still sick? We didn't know that was possible. I thought you were only supposed to be sick for 2 weeks. Never mind. Don't worry about this phone call." And then they hung up. So I have no idea.
What an extraordinarily strange experience to have, coming from ostensibly experts in their field at the CDC. But obviously you were suspicious of that. And let's just get the timeline clear. That phone call happened 4 hours after your infection.
4 months.
Excuse me, I got that wrong. That happened 4 months after your infection, and obviously you knew you were ill at that point in time, and it had been ill for the entire duration of that period.
Yeah, I was one of the few that stayed sick, like got sick and stayed sick.
Sure.
And so at that point, 4 months out, I was struggling just to walk down my driveway to the mailbox and back to the house. And doing that meant I had to sit on the couch for like 3 to 4 hours just to get my breath back so that I could like continue to think and continue to be a mom or like take care of my animals or anything else. So,
I know you shared with us a lot of experiences about trying to seek care after this period of time, and of course, up still currently, and some of the struggles you had with misinformation, disinformation, gaslighting, mistreatment, etc. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into symptoms, if you don't mind.
yeah. So the next like major event after that is in August. I decided I was having much more trouble breathing than I had prior to COVID. I was not seeming to recover, and actually my breathing seemed to get worse,
Mhm.
which now makes sense to me because I kept trying to push myself. Um, and so I called my pulmonologist trying to see if I could get in there and to explain that I was pretty sure I had post-viral illness or what was starting to be called long COVID. Um, Instead of calling me back, the pulmonologist had the person who was running our local testing facility call me, and she yelled at me for 4 hours, telling me that I was what was wrong with society, that I just needed to stop worrying, go back to work. I was working full time. That I needed to stop thinking I knew anything about viruses. And I explained my history, studying epidemiology, disease management, virology, and that I work in a genetics lab, and my 10 years plus of working in vet med, including an experience with a prior coronavirus mutation in canines that caused massive trouble when I lived out west. And she again yelled at me, told me, how dare I think I know more than anyone in the medical field, and that there was no help for someone like me who was going to try to mess with society by creating my own disease. And
An absolutely extraordinary accusation.
yeah,
I really,
she
I
is
really,
now in charge of patients who go home from the hospital with COVID and long COVID. And she has um, hosted a informational episode where she said that the only people who experience continuing COVID symptoms are those with intellectual disabilities
no.
and other reasons why they seek attention or cannot understand what's happening to their bodies,
Was
which
this
is
recently?
insulting to me in multiple ways, having a
Yeah,
child with Down syndrome.
absolutely. Thank you for sharing these stories. I think I'm always forced to say that I remain astonished, but unfortunately not terribly surprised to hear people in your position recount interactions like this. I think in many instances they're far more common um, than people who are fortunate enough to not have a disability are aware of. Um, so thank you again for sharing that. You spoke a little bit about, obviously, about seeking treatment. I did want to ask just about kind of long COVID clinics available to you in your area, in Maine or elsewhere, and your struggles with that.
So in Maine, we had a long COVID clinic very briefly for less than 6 months, I believe.
Hmm.
My doctor, my personal doctor, didn't really believe me about long COVID. Only in December 2022 did she say her sister-in-law talked her into at least diagnosing me with CFS, chronic fatigue
Chronic
syndrome,
fatigue. Yes, sorry.
which is the less preferred term, by the way. So when she heard that there was a long COVID clinic being started in Maine, she happily referred me there because she did not want to do anything with me, did not really believe in anything I was saying, and didn't believe she could help me. But I managed to get through, talk to the scheduler, just in time for her to say, we're about to close, so there's no point in even putting you on the schedule. And the governor said that primary care providers were the best to provide care for Mainers with long COVID. And so therefore there was no point in having a long COVID clinic. So it was shut down. I've heard there is a doctor in Bangor who is looking to try to start one. But after that was in the newspaper, I've heard nothing since. There
When
is
did
no care for us.
when did this long COVID clinic shut down?
I believe that was early 2023.
I see.
And I think it began somewhere around fall of 2022.
Let's move on to symptoms and long COVID symptoms. You've introduced us to a little bit of that earlier in this conversation. I suppose let's address what your physical and mental experience is with this condition today. I know you've cited numerous examples of numerous long COVID symptoms that you've experienced, and how you try to manage them.
Sorry, I just so that I can offer a little bit of hope on medical care. There are, in order for people in Maine to get care, we can go to New Hampshire. There's a POTS clinic there, or we can go down to Boston. And then the Recover study does not have a site in Maine, but the data they're collecting through the Recover study, through the All of Us study, both of those are NIH programs. And then there are CDC clinical trials that you can look up and participate in. Some of them are virtual or long distance. Otherwise, there are groups like the Younger Lab. Core Mount Sinai is working with the Petrino Lab. And all of them are coming out with blood diagnostic tests that we can take to our physicians and say, don't care if you don't believe me, this is the recommendation for people with long COVID. Please refer to it.
Can I ask a little bit more about those blood diagnostic tests? Or are you referring to diagnostics that provide some sort of, biomarker as an indication of long COVID or something to that effect?
We're just starting to find biomarkers that have potential for people with long COVID. Most of them that I've seen offering promising results are immune biomarkers.
I see.
And so those at least can give us a starting space for where to begin to try to heal ourselves. Because if our immune system is going haywire and continuously attacking us, or pointing to signs of us having an ongoing COVID infection that is
Viral
still
persistence
there,
of some kind.
then there are treatments for viral persistence. There are
Yeah.
treatments for basically resetting your immune system so that you don't have an autoimmune disease, or at least managing it. There are tricks and tools out there for each of those things if they are looked for.
That is fortunate. That's good to know. I've heard a little bit about the effort to identify biomarkers pertaining to long COVID. I was not aware there were actually studies underway that people were participating in to identify those, so I am happy to hear that. Back to if we, that's totally okay. These are important discussions, so I'm glad you're volunteering extra information. So I do appreciate that. As we were talking about, long COVID symptoms. I know you've experienced a long list of these symptoms, and I'm curious to learn more about that and how you manage them.
So something around 80% of those of us with long COVID have a condition called ME/CFS. It's a co-diagnosis. And that in particular tends to have those symptoms of post-exertional malaise, post-exertional symptom exacerbation, and POTS as a primary condition. So these are neurological and neurological, vascular, and other conditions. Dysautonomia in particular so POTS is a type of dysautonomia, but it's basically your nervous system and other parts of your body are not communicating well together. And there is research ongoing to figure out why this occurs, but that is probably my biggest issue. And that that ME/CFS leads to brain fog and cardiac symptoms. Sorry, I'm losing my line of thinking. Again, brain fog. But so I have neurological, cardiovascular, pulmonary, and other symptoms. Long COVID is associated with a list of over 200 symptoms. The group called Body Politic was the first to identify that long list and have a paper published from, I think, spring of 2021, and it's like the first research done on us long haulers.
So over 200 symptoms. I mean, clearly this list: neurological, cardiac, respiratory, a multi-systemic disorder in every sense of the word. If I may ask, for people who are less familiar with information like this, can you describe your experiences with brain fog? How would you characterize that for somebody who is unfamiliar with that sensation?
There is a wonderful thing I've written up somewhere that I keep meaning to pull up just for explanations like this, but the rough idea is, I don't know how typical this is for most people, but I typically think with multiple parts of my brain all at once. So I can have an earworm stuck in my head while at the same time like crocheting, watching a TV show, and thinking about what I'm going to make for dinner later, and thinking about a research project I'm doing at work, and thinking about like 7 other things.
Sure.
And sometimes I'll be replaying a conversation or reading a book at the same time as, anyway. And I'm one of those, I'm a speed reader who can normally read 2 pages at once. And
Wow.
When I first had COVID, the biggest thing I noticed was silence. I've never had it be silent inside my head before. Like, not only did I not have like 12 conversations going on inside my head at once, or tracks of thought going on at once, I didn't even have one. And that in itself is terrifying. And it's hard to explain, of like, if you are used to walking around the world, being able to think on multiple tracks at once and process information at the same time as you are outputting information and physically doing something, to have to think, I'm going to take a step, I'm going to take another step. And then by the time you get to where you're going, you've completely forgotten that, because you can't hold that original thought in your head. And it is only after 2.5 to 3 years that I finally was able to sing to my kids a lullaby again, because I couldn't remember what the next word was and think about how to concentrate, how to breathe, let alone the difficulty I was having with breathing. So it's only in the last like 6 months that I've had more than one track in my head again. And I am like thrilled on days when I can have an earworm and hold a conversation at the same time. And like, it's you'll reach for a thought, and sometimes it's just not there. Or like, you'll reach for a memory, something that's a core memory that you tell people that story all the time, and it's a foggy day, so you reach for it through this dense fog, and you're feeling around for it, and what you're touching hurts. Like, it physically hurts inside your brain to try to reach for a memory that you might have told the same story like 30 times. And not only can you not remember it, but grasping for it feels like it's doing you damage. Like, it's not just fog, it's like full-on brain damage, and there are bits of my memory missing that I don't know if I'll ever get back.
Thank you for sharing that. It's hard to listen to, and I'm grateful for that explanation. It must feel at times like a trap if the effort you are making to grab that thought, you are punished for. I think it's important for people to understand the labor and pain involved in that effort. Can I ask you? We've gone a little bit in depth on brain fog, on the neurological symptoms. Of course, you shared a wide set of impacts cardiac, respiratory, etc. Talk a little bit about, and you did certainly with the brain fog, a little bit more about how that impacts your ability to get through your day to day, to spend time with your family, to do your work, to care for the animals on your farm, and so on.
Um, so I luckily have a wonderful husband. Um, he was not always so wonderful, but through various trials and tribulations, he's step by step had to step up and be of more and more hands-on in our life. I had a relatively COVID safe job. We were remote for longer than most people. I mean, physically, we were still supposed to be on campus for when we had physical on-campus work. But we were allowed to stay remote for a lot longer. And when we went in, we could set our own hours and be there when people aren't there. And the air quality inside my work due to ventilation and filtration, that's really, really high because of the lab work we do. It's probably one of the safest possible jobs there is. So I kept my job and I still wear an N95, even in those really good high, like we have around 12 room air changes per hour in most of the labs, which exceeds almost anywhere. And I still wear an N95, and I've been rewarded for that because I have had all my coworkers come down with COVID at once. So
Wow.
I can only assume they spread it to each other. Um, but that means
Quick
he's
note,
to be a
masks
stay-at-home
work.
dad.
Yeah.
And our kids are very high risk and cannot get sick. And I'm not sure I could survive getting sick again either. Um, and so he he has taken over a lot of that. He has had to take over like milking the goats when I can't get out of bed. He's had to take over um, most of the feeding and farm chores, and he grumbles occasionally. Um, but for the most part, like he wants me to stay healthy as much as possible. So he does what he can so that I have that ability to recover enough to maybe get to go to the beach with the kids some days. And like, or to get to like play a board game at night with the kids. And afterwards, he will like sit me down and say, "No, you don't get to do anything. I'm doing everything else." Um, so my life would not be possible without him. Um, as it is, like when I'm at work, I do microsurgeries, and
See,
I have a thing. Part of my symptoms is an internal tremor, and lots of people have talked about being unable to show this tremor, but under a microscope you can see it. And
interesting.
on days when I've pushed too hard the day before, doing my job can be near impossible because I physically cannot keep my hands from shaking. Um, or like I work a really I need my brain for my job. Um, it is very complex, cutting edge science stuff. And I have to be able to speak eloquently, even when my brain will not grab any of the words I'm intending for it to. Um, and luckily, again, I have a boss who is like kind and compassionate. And part of that's because we work with disease models and we work with people with diseases. Um, so I think it comes with the job a little bit, but also they're just good people. And without the flexibility my job offers, I don't think I could still be working. And I don't think I could have even as much energy as I do to do events like this or to milk my goats or to be a mom at all.
So I wanted to ask you now, about we talked previously about the challenges you've experienced in seeking care and support. Um, you transitioned very nicely, I think, into discussing, the effort your husband has put in helping you and how essential his role is in helping you navigate the day. Share a little bit more about, what aspects of support you receive that you find helpful, and then if you can, reflect on what support you'd like to see for yourself personally, as well as for the long COVID community at large.
Um, So again, my family is one of the biggest things I rely on. Like even without my husband's help, the fact that I have a kind home to return to is a big deal, and so I seek that in community as well. Um, I I am admin actually for C19 Long Haulers Advocacy Project. And they're mostly Facebook based. They have a website so you can find your individual state. And they also do special interest populations. Um, and they're basically a support and advocacy group. There's a whole bunch of other groups, including Long COVID Alliance. I wrote a list, so I didn't have to remember this. Long COVID families, long COVID kids. They're mostly UK based, but they are doing tons of research on what long COVID looks like in kids and have it on their website with helpful infographics. Long COVID physio, so those of us who are seeking help and care from our doctors, they actually have advice for how to get physical therapy support. There are groups specifically built for doctors. Again, more European based, but they have a US component. There's the Body Politic, which is the original long COVID group. Oh, I just realized there's another one I forgot to put on here, and as soon as I thought about it, it disappeared from my brain. Anyway, there's Dysautonomia International, ME Action, and Solve ME, and both of those are obviously focused more on other disabilities, but they've put together these great resource pages to help people find doctors and care. WHN has actually just rolled out a tool to help people find doctors in their area who are COVID aware. But they also have like resources on what is ME/CFS, what is long COVID. They link to the CDC pages and NIH pages talking about this. So if your doctor doesn't want to listen to anything any of these long COVID groups say, they can take it straight from the government. Places like the Bateman Horn Center and each of the labs I talked about earlier, Younger Lab and Putrino Lab, and their new YouTube channel, the Core Mount Sinai, and many others are dedicated to trying to actually start groups that'll teach physicians and rolling out that education. And that's one of the biggest things I think we need right now is there isn't education for doctors, for the public, for like any of the tools we need to rely on to survive, which means that most of the places and people we interact with don't know anything about long COVID, and we face stigma and excess challenges and need to spend more energy just to survive. And so that education in order to get the support we need is, I think, the biggest challenge.
I'm glad you spoke about that. That's something I really want to emphasize. I think a lot of people who are fortunate enough to not live with a disability assume, first of all, they assume it's the likelihood of them ever becoming disabled is slim to none, but they assume that if that does occur to them, that there will be help. In many instances, that is not the case. And when it comes to long COVID in particular, I think it's worth emphasizing again the extent to which people in your position are not only dealing with the burden of living with this condition, but are effectively asked to build the plane as they fly it, in the sense that you are also responsible for constructing the infrastructure necessary for you to get the care that you need.
I've actually brought a research article to my doctor and said, hey, this is advice on how to treat me. And he says, oh, I don't trust any articles from non-vetted resources. And I said, this is from Nature, the paper Nature. And he's like, oh, I don't think that they're a reliable source. And I was like, do you have any sources you think are reliable? Because this has been republished in the Journal of American Medicine and several other things that I don't think you can say are not reliable. And he's like, oh no, since it was in Nature, I'm not interested. So where do I get help if you can't even build the plane as you're in it because the materials don't exist? And this is where I lay a lot of the blame on the basis of ableism in our society. And like that whole idea of if you are not fully standing on your own alone with no supports whatsoever, then you have lost value. to society. And that's been a fight for me even before long COVID. Sorry. And it's something I remembered that I meant to bring up in this is often doctors, instead of believing us, want to send us to psychiatrists to say that we have
Sure.
anxiety or psychiatric issues, and that all of our symptoms are in our head, despite seeing blood pressures up in stroke levels or heart rates over 150 for hours at a time. Or seeing like autoimmune profiles that are way wonky. They try to claim it's all psychosomatic, as in our body is creating this because we are so anxious about COVID. And this is in particular a problem for women who make up the majority of the long COVID community.
Women and women of color in particular being the target of that
Yes.
kind of extraordinarily ill-conceived attention on the part of healthcare professionals, and I use that term guardedly in this circumstance, is something that has existed well before long COVID, and regrettably persists to this day in 2024.
Hence hysteria.
Indeed. Thank you for reiterating that again. I'll just highlight again, that thought that medical education being so critical for people with long COVID to actually get effective care, kind of a critical step. What do you've spoken, you've shared so much of your time and you've spoken, I think, so eloquently about what you're experiencing, about how it's impacted you, about how it's impacted your family, about what you've learned from the time you became ill until now. Tell us some more. What do you want people to know? What have we missed? What do you want people to know about long COVID? What steps do you think people should take? What should we be aware of?
I think as a brief thing, as I said, this interview will have costs for me.
Yeah.
And I don't know how visible this is to the viewer, as this is mostly an invisible illness. My face is probably not yet doing it. It's at least not visible on the camera. But I have a fever. I've had a fever almost every day for the last 9 years, and I can feel my face, or for the last 4 years, and I can feel my face flushing right now, which means
I
my
see.
temperature is starting to spike, which is one of my early indicators that I'm starting to wear myself. And I can hear the rasp in my voice picking up, which is actually one of my tricks for being able to tell when I'm communicating with someone else in my long COVID or at least
No
ME/CFS
kidding.
community.
Okay.
But the other things I really want people to know is avoid getting this. Don't get it. It's awful. I spent my first few weeks bedbound. I spent the next several months like barely able to stand up, barely able to walk in and out of my house, not able to like be a mom and take care of my kids properly and able to enjoy them when I was able to be near them. Struggling to stay working, even with a workplace that was so accommodating. Struggling to like be the wife I want to be with my husband, be the partner I want to be. And there's no healthcare, at least in my area. And so like, this is a miserable situation to be in, to be so hurt and have so few people believe you, so few people support you. And I am in this one way lucky to have at least my family around me. But this is not something you want. And numbers currently are around 1 in 3 COVID infections leads to long COVID, or at least some post-acute symptom condition. Symptom or condition. That's not what that stands for. PASC, post-acute. I don't remember. I don't fight for thoughts anymore. If they're not coming, it's not worth fighting for them. I've learned this.
This is also something we should know about long COVID. So
yeah. But the big things you can fight for is ventilation and air quality in all public spaces, especially schools. Around 70% of our infections are through school children. And like they should not be faced with multiple COVID infections through their lifetime, because they're gonna end up like this as adults, as young adults, and we don't need to do that to our next generation. So avoid getting sick, wear a mask, fight for ventilation. That's actually the only thing that I'm really proud of for doing with my local school and joining the school board. I literally joined just to get a ventilation system in the school and succeeded. And the
That's
levels of
fantastic.
illness have plummeted. If you do get COVID and you've done everything you can to prevent it, or even if you didn't, if you do get COVID, rest, radically rest. It's one of the few things that is that is connected to decreasing your likelihood of getting long COVID. It's part of why the wealthier and more privileged among us have lower rates of long COVID, is they have the fortune to be able to rest and recover properly, unlike those of us that have to return to work immediately. And again, I was type A personality. I do everything and anything I possibly can. And I blame that as to why I not only never recovered, but have long COVID still almost 4.5 years later. Long COVID's real. There are millions of us in the US with it right now. Some estimates are around 6 to 7% of the US population is currently dealing with long COVID. It's definitely 6 to 7% in Maine. And I know it's a little higher and lower depending upon where in the country you are, but that's too many. And the CDC estimated early last year that something like 26 million Americans were out of work or underemployed due to long COVID, either themselves or for caring for someone with long COVID. Like, this is a huge economic, and like, it harms us in so many ways. And so anything you can do to prevent it is worth it.
I know that even I know that one of the things that people are most vocal about, is that even the most merciless, capitalist in our current economic system should be concerned about this because, of course, the net effect is so much lost time to work, lost income, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'll reiterate, what you shared about efforts to stay safe, clean air above all, masking, and radical rest. I think that is also another term that's a little bit new to me, I confess, but I have a feeling is probably fairly well known amongst the long
Well,
COVID
so
community, certainly, and other groups as well.
to demonstrate radical rest, um, there are people who were sick with COVID and were just like, it's fine, I'll just pot in my garden. That's
Nope.
not resting. That's physical activity. There are people who, during crashes, were just like, it's fine, I'll just scroll on my phone through Twitter. That can be too much mental activity. That can be too much
Thinking,
work.
yeah,
So, like,
absorbing
radical rest
information.
means doing the least possible that you can and still stay sane. Like, some of us need to read books, need to be doing something in order to survive, but do as little as you can get away with.
Thank you for emphasizing that. I've had that conversation with myself and with friends when we've gotten sick. I was one of those people who was fortunate by virtue of my job to be able to rest. I am incredibly grateful for that. I share that information as well as often as I can. Thank you for making clear what radical rest means. I think after such a valuable discussion, moving forward, what gives you hope in these circumstances?
Um, the big things are support groups and groups like WHN trying to
Yeah.
provide this education, trying to provide awareness. And the people I'm seeing joining our groups, especially when they're joining our groups not as patients. There are moments where legislators are starting to propose long COVID support bills to end up helping us actually apply for and get disability, or to help us be able to get financial support, or at least to get things to help us get through our worst crashes, so that the worst things I've seen in the support groups are people who have decided that they are too financially costly to their families anymore, and they give up and literally on existing. So the people who are stepping up and stepping in to make it so that nobody has to be that bleak. There are supports out there. There are still COVID, long COVID supports through the federal government. They're hard to find. And that's why these support groups are 100% necessary. Any signs that we're getting from authority figures that they understand the accessibility and accommodations needed for people suffering from long COVID. Sorry, I hesitate on suffering because it's, for most disabilities, people don't want to be told that they are suffering with a disability. But that's one of the terms that is still most of us with long COVID agree with, that we are suffering with this. Especially those of us who, like me, want to go do everything, who don't want to say no to anything, and want to like physically be out there and doing everything we can. And we have to hold ourselves back from overcommitting, but also from doing even little things like playing with our kids. Like, it's definitely suffering. But so authority figures who are like accommodating masks in work, accommodating, like allowing Corsi Rosenthal boxes, or like the existence of Corsi Rosenthal boxes is another. But like any of the tools we can use to stay safe from COVID and to get like screen readers and other accessibility tools so that we can have an easier time staying in our jobs and continuing to do the things we want to do to be part of life. So each of those baby steps and signs that point towards research being successful, and that there is potentially a future still there. I'm starting to see people in my long COVID cohort from March 2020 are starting to have more heart attacks and strokes. And so it is a fine line between that hope of what is beginning to happen and that fear of what damage I'm doing to myself trying to maintain to get to that future.
Crystal Burke, I thank you from the bottom of my heart personally, and I think everybody at WHN shares that thought. Thank you so much for your time and attention that you've given us today. This, is just the first video, we hope, of a short series speaking to people who are in similar circumstances, and I think your willingness to share your story and provide us with these details hopefully will help explain to people the true impact of this condition and motivate people to pay attention and make good choices and go to bat for long COVID care. Thank you so much. Any final thoughts? You've said so much. I want to make sure I give you the opportunity to share a final word if you have one.
I want to express gratefulness for everyone who listens to this message and takes it seriously and does their best to prevent getting COVID and spreading COVID. Families like mine honestly can't get sick with anything. So we are still in hiding. My kids can't go to school. My kids can't really see family because we have to be in isolation. And so every step that people are taking to take all of this seriously and prevent further illness is hope for not just me, but my whole family. And so I'm so grateful for every little step forward.
Thank you so much. Once again, we've had a pretty extraordinary conversation with long COVID patient, sufferer, long hauler,
Advocate.
Crystal Burke. Advocate. That is definitely the thing that I was, the list of roles that I was missing in that list. I apologize. With long COVID advocate, Crystal Burke, who has given us her time and her energy to share her story with us today. I'll reiterate very quickly that this is the first in a series of videos that's part of WHN's Long COVID Awareness Project. So we hope you will stay tuned to YouTube in the future for more videos in the series. And of course, you can visit whn.global for more information about what the organization does and about the Long COVID Awareness Project. Thanks again, Crystal Burke. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thank you.